For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon Derehove. Journalist and author Mark Gevisser joins me to discuss his book, Lost and Found in Johannesburg. There is a line in the book where you say, "Do you remember the times when you looked up from a page and the world was different?" The book is filled with these epiphanies. Can you talk about some of these moments and what they have revealed to you about yourself?
Well, that line relates to when I discovered the poetry of Oswald Mchali and Mongeni Wali Soroti, and with that poetry discovered about more from in the book about what life for black South Africans was like. Obviously, as a white South African, I didn't know. The epiphany with which I begin the book, my book, was actually happened, that provides the framing metaphor for the book, in fact, was when I looked up from a book, and that book was the Holmden's Registry of Johannesburg, which was the Johannesburg street map until the late 70s, and which I was absolutely obsessed with as a child. And I would play this game, which I've retrospectively called Dispatcher, whereby I would find an address in the phone directory and send an imaginary courier out to that address from my home, delivering goodies. And this is the way I kind of transcended the bounds of, I guess, my very comfortable but very bounded suburban existence. So the epiphany that happened was when I went to the phone book and I found one of the few black names in the phone book from the 70s, let's say Mpatlele M. And the address was an address in Alexandra. And I knew what Alexandra was. I knew it was a thing called a township and a place where black people live, but I had no idea where it was. I mean, our experience was so different from the black experience that, I mean, Alexandra might as well have been on another planet. And the epiphany was that Alexandra was on the next page of the book. And more than that, that was firstly the epiphany, that it was so close and I didn't know. And secondly, that there was no mapped way of getting my courier from page 79 where I lived to page 77 where Alexandra was. There was just kind of the solid red line between the two. And that was kind of cartographically the beginning of my political consciousness. And then a similar epiphany, even more dramatic, a few years later, when I was 12 and the Soweto uprising happened in June 76. And, you know, being this nerdy little kid obsessed with maps, I went to the map book and I looked for Soweto because I thought if I find Soweto on the map, I'll understand. I mean, that's kind of how I work. And the epiphany was that Soweto wasn't there. And, you know, it just didn't exist. It had not been mapped. Well, actually, that wasn't the epiphany. That was the shock. The epiphany came afterwards when very soon afterwards there was a map guide to Witwatersrand that did for the first time include Soweto. And the epiphany was that Soweto was like as big as Johannesburg, and there were streets and schools marked and police stations and churches, and it was an epiphany that it was a whole world. But still it was not something I knew, it was only something I could imagine about. So the real epiphanies happened when I took myself away from books, when I was old enough to take myself away from books and dispatch myself to all these places I'd previously dreamed of.
The book seems to defy falling neatly into one particular genre. It is in a sense a memoir, but also a political history of Johannesburg. How would you describe the book, if at all?
I don't like the word memoir for it, even though I'm comfortable with the word memoir for it, because it has to belong somewhere on a bookshelf, and memoir is a good place. It is subjective writing. It's looking at the world from my perspective. And the way I understand it is a journey across the landscape of Johannesburg, but sort of at the same time a journey into the interior. And in the interior, obviously, of my mind. And it's about those two journeys simultaneously, and how the two journeys talk to each other and the delicate balance between them. So there's a lot of memoir in it. There's some family history that about how my family came to South Africa and where they come from, because they were Lithuanian Jewish immigrants. There's a lot about my childhood and my adolescence and how I dealt with the fact that I was gay. But there's also, I spend many chapters, because I'm a journalist by in my blood, and I understand myself by understanding others. So I understand others by understanding myself. So I spend time wandering around Johannesburg with a transgender sangoma, or with two older black gay men from Soweto, or with a woman who has dedicated her life to fighting acid mine drainage, or the groundsman at the Wilds. So I'm with other people and looking at Johannesburg through their eyes, and looking at the Johannesburg that I discover through old photographs and maps as well all the time too.
Now, recurring metaphors in the book are that of the fringe country and the borderland. Can you talk a little bit about what they mean?
Yeah. So I spoke about how, as a little boy, there was the thick red line between where I lived in Sandton and Alexandra. And I suppose my life's project has been, well, two things. Firstly, in my life's project as a writer, but also I think as a conscious, sentient being. The first thing is always to try and see the other side. But if you're trying to see the other side, you have to know your side as well. So that means crossing boundaries to see the other side. But I'm also really interested in the way a line, which is a border, can be expanded into a territory, which is a borderland or a fringe country. And I believe that we actually, most of us, live in the borderlands. But for convenience sake, we put ourselves on one side or the other. Our identities are always a lot more complex than they allow. And we put ourselves, particularly in a city like Johannesburg or in a context like South Africa, we put borders around us to protect ourselves. And we need to. We need those borders. And we need those borders, you know, for both psychological and security reasons, physical reasons. But I think understanding and accepting the borderland is part of being, certainly part of being a Joburger and a South African, but also part of being human. And I suppose the borderland is, I've always felt myself as living on the borderland, because I felt different from a very young age, perhaps because of my sexuality. So that makes me understand the borderland or the fringe country in some way. The term fringe country comes from a really wonderful essay by the great black South African journalist Nat Nakasa, which was published in Drum magazine in 1962, called Fringe Country, Where There Is No Colour Bar. And I write about this and reproduce it in my book a lot. And it shows at the height of apartheid, the places, the borderlands, where black people and white people could find each other, hang out together, be physically intimate with each other, love each other, but still, you know, within certain boundaries.
The attack in the Kalani flat has had quite a central role in your book, yet you already had a working manuscript of this book at the time of the attack. How did its inclusion change the book? In January 2012, I was in Johannesburg with a physical manuscript of the book that I was doing revisions on, and I was due to hand in the manuscript a few weeks later. And at that time, I went to visit two friends at their flat in Killarney to watch a TV series with them, and we were subject to a brutal, lengthy home invasion. 3 armed men, guns to our heads, gagged, bound. An experience that I'm sure many people watching this have had too. By no means a unique experience. One of my friends was raped. It was terrible. It was traumatic. We all survived. And I was faced with this dilemma. I mean, I'm writing a book about Johannesburg and my relationship with it. And I'm also writing a book about borders and boundaries. And here's a border that was violated, and what do I do about it? And I really didn't want to write about the attack to begin with, for 2 reasons. Firstly, because I was nearly finished. But secondly, because I just didn't want this to be another crime story about Johannesburg. In the end, I did write about the attack, and I did it for 2 reasons. Firstly, because the attack sort of wrote itself. And writing about the attack was, for me, a form of healing. Because I'm a writer, I mean, everybody has their own way of getting through this, because we have to get through it. But writing about it was a form of healing for me, because it was a way of making order out of chaos. You know, the chaos of those 3 hours where you didn't know what the end was going to be. And the order of sentences and paragraphs in a story where you know what the ending's going to be, and you know it turns out okay. And it was also a way of making
beauty out of ugliness, and I mean the ugliness of the experience and the beauty of choosing the right word or finding the right metaphor to describe fear. So it was healing, and so I had this writing, and I decided I was going to include it in the book, but not as the end of the book. So if you want to use the sort of classic Shakespearean dramatic structure, it's the climactic fourth act of the book. But the fifth act, which is more important to me, is the aftermath and how we came back from it, and how we came back from it. Firstly, by insisting that the police and the criminal justice system do its job, and in our instance we were very lucky that they were able to do its job, and there's a man sitting in jail. I mean, there's still 2 men at large, but there's a man sitting in jail. And secondly, by fighting to resist the kind of walls of fear that we build higher and higher around us when we're victims of attacks. The kind of walls of fear that we're hearing about in the Oscar Pistorius trial at the moment, where we're being led to believe that the reason why Oscar did what he did was because he had a terror of a black man with a gun to his head. And how important it is, how important it was for me to resist that fear. And so my last chapter is actually called Hope in Alexandra, because I decided that rather than getting on a plane and going back to Paris, which is where I live at the moment, I was going to stay in South Africa and deal with my fear, stay in Joburg and deal with my fear. Partly because somebody said, if you close the door now, you'll never be able to come back. But more because I just wanted to resist the kind of racial profiling that happens. And so I went to Alexandra, and I went to Alexandra because even though I know as a journalist, I've come to know Johannesburg incredibly well. Interestingly enough, one place I never really got to know through all my professional work or all my friendships was Alexandra. And I thought, how weird is this, that this boundary still exists in my brain from that map from when I was a child. So I decided I was going to go back to Alexandra, and I was going to learn about Alexandra. And that was my kind of way of healing. And I write about how in the book.
Your writing often appears to be about understanding and delving into the psychology of your subject. How is it different when you are the subject you are writing about?
It's very complicated for me to be the subject. I'm much more comfortable asking other people about themselves. Like, what am I doing here? I should be talking to you. I should be asking you to talk about yourself. But it's been very rich, and I've learned a lot. But I believe the graveyard of any kind of memoir writing is inauthenticity, or when people don't write truly about their experiences. Now, there are some experiences I can't write truly about. I'm not ready to, or I don't want to. I want to keep it for myself. So I've tried really hard to only put in that book that which I can write about, and I've kept a lot back for myself. As I think all memoirists do. I think that's part of the deal.
Any new projects on the horizon?
I'm currently working on a book which is provisionally titled called The Global Sexuality Frontier, which is looking at the new global conversation about sexuality rights of gay people, transgender people, etc. And this is a global conversation. It's happening in the United States around same-sex marriage. It's happening in Uganda about the most basic rights to security and dignity. But it's all connected, and I'm looking at how it's connected and why, and how this has become a global conversation and what effect this global conversation is having. The world is in this respect is totally different to how it was 10 years ago, and it will be totally different again in 10 years' time, and I'm trying to understand that.
Well, I wish you all the best, and thank you so much for your time.
Good, you're welcome.